A well-known humorous piece of logic sets out to prove that there cannot be any human beings. Now, not only is this kind of funny, it'll give you a bit of a giggle if you hear it, but it should also give you reason to pause and to think about when people present these sort of types of lines of reasoning to you, especially in things like, for example, ontological arguments for the existence of this God thing that so many people believe in. So let's first of all explore this humorous proof, and then let's see what the wider implications of realizing that there is something fundamentally wrong with what I'm doing here. Okay, so first of all, let's look at a number of premises that are completely commonsensical. For example, the first premise is that every human being was born from a mother who herself was, of course, a human being. That is a fact of life that really cannot be denied by anybody who is in any way sane in any case. So this, however, leaves us with a problem, because if I am a human being and my mother is therefore logically a human being according to my premise, well, if my mother is a human being, then her mother is a human being. And if that person, my grandmother, was a human being, then of course her mother was a human being. You can see where this leads. You will be presented with a line of reasoning that leads you to consider an infinite number of ancestors, extending an infinite amount of time into the past, and that is of course clearly absurd, because this planet is only 4.6 billion years old, or thereabouts, and human beings have only been around for about 100,000 years, according to paleontologists and evolutionary scientists. You know, ballpark, 200, 300,000 years maybe, who knows, but definitely not a million years. So what is going on here? Well, what is going on, and this is again, this is something that should give you reason to pause. What is going on is that the process of evolution is the sort of process that a lot of people cannot get their heads around. You see, when we look at each other, we see human beings. And of course, we can very easily distinguish ourselves as human beings from other life forms that are clearly not human beings. So it is natural to assume that a human being as a concept is something that is well defined and that can be applied to any living entity and give you a yes or no answer. You give it a living entity, and either that living entity is a human being or it is not. Logical, straightforward, commonsensical, right? Except it clearly cannot be true. Now, if you start realizing this, then where is the problem here? Because on the one hand, your assumption is actually not wrong. When you're saying that a human being must necessarily have a mother who herself was a human being, then that is absolutely correct. And that is something that is true for anybody who can be labeled as a human being. Think about it for a moment. Even if you are thinking about evolution and you are laboring under this misunderstanding that evolution boils down to, for example, at some point in the past, something that, as people put it, wasn't quite a chicken, laid an egg out of which hatched the first chicken. Think about that from the perspective of the first human being. According to that scenario, something, according to some people's understanding of evolution, something that wasn't quite a human being gave birth to the first human being. Now think about what it would have been like for that first human being. Growing growing up, looking at its mother, what do you think, how do you think that human being would have perceived its mother? Would it have said, she's not quite the same as me, she is slightly different to me? Of course not. That is a nonsensical idea, a nonsensical notion altogether. To anybody who has ever thought about themselves as a person, it would have been self-evident and obvious that their mother was, of course, also a human being, also a person, the same as themselves, the same species as themselves, kin, whatever you want to call it. The problem is that we have these labels for things, like, for example, human being, that are only useful to a certain extent. The label human being is eminently useful today. Why? Because we, as a species, are separated from other species by huge chasms of separated development. In other words, we can today, given a living human being, easily point at that person and say, that's a human being, and point at a chimp and say, that's not a human being. However, if you start going back into the past, it all becomes fuzzy, it all becomes blurry, it all becomes difficult to figure out. And what is really important is that you should realize that there is not going to be a sharp dividing line. There's not going to be a discrete point in the past at which you could say that's when the first human being was born. There is no Adam, there is no Eve, there is no such thing as a first human being. The concept of human being is something that we invented, first of all, and if we want to look at our ancestors and we want to consider the emergence of Homo sapiens into the world, it is an emergent process. It is a slow evolving process by which our species emerged into its existence. It didn't simply start with a first human being. Now take that understanding of evolutionary processes, processes between order and chaos, on that knife edge at which complexity emerges spontaneously and in ways that can be mathematically described, so not in any sort of magical, supernatural ways, but completely naturally. At those points in time where complexity emerges, and then think about how some people, like for example Thomas Aquinas, present these hugely simplistic ontological arguments for the existence of their God, based on a regression into time of concepts that they deem to be constant and immutable and simple. And then you start understanding why anybody presented with concepts, with arguments like ontological arguments for the existence of God, and arguments such as a bold assertion that infinite regression cannot exist, should take such assertions with a large pinch of salt. I would even suggest dismiss them out of hand, because they are not supported by anything in reality.